It is said that the sea keeps more secrets than the land ever could, holding them in its unbroken, rolling quiet, far from the sound of human footsteps. Some of those secrets wash ashore in the form of driftwood, or a stray plank with a half-erased marking, or a bottle carrying a letter with the ink more water than words. And some secrets never rise at all, staying in the deep where the pressure keeps them locked away. But a few are spoken of, if you know the right places to listen. And among the longshoremen of the eastern seaboard, especially those who linger in waterfront bars long after midnight, when the jukebox is tired and the neon lights are humming softly like insects, there is an old story that comes up sometimes. A story told slowly, as if the storyteller himself is getting drowsier with each sentence. It is the story of the most peculiar ship theft in American maritime history, the disappearance and recovery of the Catherine May, a coastal cargo vessel that vanished from Charleston Harbor in the early 1890s without a single cannon fired, without a single alarm raised, without even the faintest splash to suggest sabotage. It is a story stitched together from newspaper clippings browned by salt air, from handwritten depositions that smell faintly of mildew, and from the half-dreaming reminiscences of sailors who lived long enough to forget most things, but not this. And though it never reached the cultural popularity of certain pirate legends, it remains, at least for those who love quiet mysteries, one of the most astonishing incidents ever recorded. To tell this story properly, one must begin slowly, the way a tide comes in, spreading across the sand in flat, gentle breaths. You may find the pace lulls you, as if it were the sea itself rocking you toward sleep. That's all right. This tale is patient. It has waited more than a century to be heard again, and it does not mind taking its time. The Catherine May was a modest ship, not large for her era, just shy of 140 feet, with a rounded bow and a hull painted the color of dried tobacco leaves. Her figurehead wasn't a woman or an animal, but a carved knot of oak, polished so smooth that sailors joked it looked like a clenched fist. She had been built in Bath, Maine, where the shipyards prided themselves on vessels that were stout rather than beautiful, tough rather than fast. Her keel was strong enough to weather the Atlantic's tantrums, yet her draft was shallow enough to glide into the smaller ports that lined the American coastline like a string of beads. She hauled everything from winter wheat to brickstone to barrels of pitch and crates of spare machine parts for the factories rising like iron flowers in the Northeast. For most of her working life, the Catherine May was captained by Jonas Hargrove, a man whose personality was often described as steady, sturdy, or sometimes as expressive as a granite post. Hargrove wasn't unfriendly. He simply moved through the world with a deliberate calm, the kind that made passengers trust him instantly. His crew respected him because he never asked of them what he wouldn't do himself, and because he had a habit of inspecting the rigging every morning at dawn, touching each rope as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. By the winter of 1892, the Catherine May had made 163 successful voyages, some long, some short, all of them unremarkable except for their predictability. Hargrove was a man who believed deeply in the power of routines, and he brought that philosophy to the ship with such devotion that sailors joked the Catherine May sailed not on wind, but on schedule. It is precisely because everything about the ship was so ordinary, so consistent, so solidly uneventful, that the events of March 1893 were so shocking. In the hours before dawn on March 17th, the Catherine May vanished from Charleston Harbor. Not merely sailed early, not merely drifted loose from her moorings, vanished.
By the time the sun rose, a pale, tired disk behind a sheet of morning fog, the berth where she had been tied was empty. The ropes were missing, The gangplank was missing. Even the wooden posts to which she had been secured were missing, torn clean from the wharf as though by a giant hand. There were no splintered remains, no drag marks, no broken hardware, no sign of struggle or fire or panic. The watchman on duty that night, an elderly man named Thomas Eagerly, claimed he had heard nothing unusual except a kind of distant humming, which he attributed at the time to either a foghorn or the ringing in his own ears. The harbor authorities were baffled. Ships did not simply disappear. Ships creaked, groaned, complained. They required crew, wind, guidance. And even if a band of thieves had somehow managed to board, untie, commandeer, and silently maneuver a 140-foot cargo vessel out of a busy harbor under cover of night, the tide patterns that evening had been sluggish. The currents alone should have made such an escape nearly impossible without the clatter of winches or the shouted coordination of men pulling at lines. Yet the empty water offered no explanation. Captain Jonas Hargrove was not on board when the ship vanished. He had been spending the night at a modest lodging house near East Bay Street, a habit of his whenever the ship was docked for longer than a day. When the authorities informed him that the Catherine May was gone, he stared at them in silence for several seconds, taking in the news as though it were an oddly phrased sentence he needed to parse carefully. Eventually, he said only, "That can't be," and asked to be shown the berth. But standing on the wharf, staring at the calm, undisturbed water, Hargrove said nothing. The crewman who gathered beside him later recalled that he simply looked numb, not angry, not panicked, just emptied, as if something in him had slipped loose and drifted out to sea. The investigation began immediately. The Charleston Harbor Patrol launched rowboats, skiffs, and steam cutters to scour the surrounding waters. The U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, the precursor to today's Coast Guard, sent word up and down the coast for all stations to keep watch for any vessel matching the Catherine May's description. Harbor masters in Savannah, Wilmington, Norfolk, and Boston were alerted. Telegraph offices transmitted the news faster than the coastal winds could blow. But there was no sign. Not a floating board, not a dropped crate, not an anchor scratch on the sandy shallows beyond Fort Sumter. For a full week, newspapers speculated wildly. Some suggested pirates, though piracy in American waters had been virtually extinguished by that time. Others blamed Confederate diehards who refused to accept the post-war world and sought ships for some phantom rebellion. A few papers, eager to boost sales, hinted at something supernatural, a ghost ship, a sea serpent, an unexplained current that swallowed vessels whole. Meanwhile, Captain Hargrove remained quiet. He answered investigators' questions with precision expected of him, but he volunteered nothing. To those who knew him well, his silence was troubling. He was a man of routine, and without his ship, he seemed unanchored, drifting through his days like a sleepwalker. On the 9th day after the disappearance, he received an unsigned letter. The handwriting was careful, the ink a dark, watery brown, the paper thin and crinkled along the edges as though it had been carried for a long time in a damp pocket. There was only one sentence written dead center. "If you want her returned, come alone to the Lighthouse on Daufuskie." No time, no date, no instructions, just the message, and a faint smell of brine clinging to the paper. Daufuskie Island, situated between Savannah and Hilton Head, was sparsely populated at the time. Its lighthouse, completed in 1873, stood on the island's north tip, overlooking a channel known for its shifting sandbars. Even locals hesitated to sail near it at night. Captain Jonas Hargrove said nothing to the authorities. Whether he felt they would dismiss the letter or whether he feared endangering the ship's return is unclear. What is clear is that he hired a small fishing skiff that same afternoon and set out alone, rowing steadily south along the coast. The weather was calm, and the sky a soft, empty blue, the kind that seems to quiet the thoughts of those beneath it. It took him most of the evening to reach Dofusky. As he neared the island, the lighthouse came into view, a pale, narrow column rising from the darkening shoreline. Its lamp had not been lit yet, and for a moment the structure looked abandoned, ghostly.
Hargrove beached the skiff and walked up the sandy path toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of wet grass and distant rain. Cicadas droned somewhere inland, their rhythm slow and hypnotic. When he reached the base of the lighthouse, he found the door slightly ajar. A faint yellow glow leaked from within, flickering as if from a lantern swaying in a draft. He stepped inside. There was no one there. The lantern rested on the floor. The room was empty except for the spiral staircase winding upward like a coiled spine. He climbed it slowly. His boots echoed against the iron steps, each tap loud enough to wake whatever memories the tower held. At the top, he pushed the hatch open and stepped onto the small circular platform where the lighthouse keeper tended the lamp. The breeze lifted the edge of his coat. The sea stretched out in all directions, vast and undisturbed. And then he saw it. Far offshore, perhaps half a mile, a silhouette sat on the water. A familiar silhouette. A hull with a rounded bow. A mast just slightly aft of center. A shape he could identify even in his sleep. The Catherine May. She was anchored, quiet, utterly still. Her sails were furled. Her deck was empty. No lanterns burned aboard her. For a long time, Hargrove just stared. Relief, confusion, disbelief, all of them settled on him in slow, overlapping waves. Then another sound reached him. Footsteps. Not behind him, but below, echoing faintly from the base of the tower. Someone was climbing the staircase. Hargrove turned toward the hatch, waiting, his pulse steady despite everything. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged into the lantern room. The man who stepped into the light was thin, wiry, with a beard trimmed close to the jaw and hair tucked beneath a salt-stained cap. His coat looked like it had been out in too many storms, and his boots were crusted with sand. But what struck Hargrove most were his eyes, pale, almost clouded, as though he spent more time staring at fog than at land. "You came," the man said. Hargrove did not answer. He simply waited. The man smiled faintly, an odd, distant expression, as if he were smiling at some memory only he could see. "That ship of yours," he said softly. "She listens." Hargrove felt a chill, though the night was warm. "I've never known a ship that listens quite the way she does. Most vessels, they creak, they speak, they complain. But yours?" He tilted his head. "She listens. Like she's waiting." Hargrove finally spoke. "Where is my crew?" The man blinked, slowly, as if surfacing from a long thought. "There was no crew aboard." "That's impossible," Hargrove replied. "They were sleeping on her last night." "They weren't," the man said gently. "Not when I found her." "Found her? What do you mean?" The man's pale eyes shifted back toward the distant silhouette of the Catherine May. "Sometimes a ship wants to be found. She was drifting just outside the harbor, calm as you please. No anchor down, no wheel lashed, no crew, no sound. She came to me." "That's not—" Hargrove began, but the man lifted a hand. "Your crew is safe, or as safe as any men can be who disembark before a ship decides to leave without them." Hargrove bristled. Ships don't decide anything. The man's smile grew very small. You're a good captain, Jonas, but you don't know everything. Hargrove stiffened. He hadn't introduced himself. The stranger stepped fully into the lantern's glow. It told me your name, he whispered. A long silence stretched between them, the kind that makes even the air seem to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the man stepped backward, toward the hatch, toward the long drop down the lighthouse staircase. Hargrove lunged, hand outstretched, but the stranger slipped away, moving with remarkable speed for a man so thin. His boots clanged down the iron steps in a rapid, spiraling rhythm. Hargrove followed, but by the time he reached the base of the tower, the door was swinging open in the wind, and the man was gone. There were no footprints in the sand except Hargrove's own. More disturbingly, the Catherine May, so clearly anchored offshore minutes earlier, was gone as well. Only an empty patch of moonlit water remained.